Yeah.
I think we've gone live. All right. Welcome to NASFic's first panel, I believe, uh, on history in genre. I think we can begin with panelists introducing themselves. So if you'll give a bit of your background and your preferred pronouns, we'll go from there. And you alphabetically, no, Alaya, you're first.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Alaya Don Johnson, she, her pronouns. I am a writer of science fiction and fantasy. My fantasy tends to be historical, like my most recent novel, just published from Tor in July, called Trouble the Saints, which is set in 1942, just before the U.S. entrance into World War II. Ooh, look in my book. Oh, thanks, Anne. Yeah, so that's historical fiction with kind of like magical elements that could be considered sort of a light alternate history. Also published a pair of 1920s vampire novels. I have a master's degree in Mesoamerican Studies from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, where I studied the role of fermented food in pre-Columbian religious rituals and the agricultural calendar.
Ooh. Anne.
Okay, so I am an avid reader and collector of, among other things, historical science fiction and fantasy. And I am also a con runner. People here have noted that I'm one of the members of the programming team, so I've been very busy the last couple weeks. And as a con runner, I have become an advocate of diversity and inclusion in the genre in general, and in cons and discussions. And on the not science fiction side, I have a degree in history. I'm a docent at the William C. Goodrich Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum here in York, Pennsylvania. And I'm also a member of our York County History Center's historic writers group. And I write a lot on and edit on Wikipedia. So I've given them a talk on how to edit Wikipedia, and I guess that's me in a nutshell.
That's great. Gillian.
I have a PhD in history, and this is really important. I've made here's something I prepared earlier. One of my areas of academic expertise is on how writers use history in their fiction. I don't do that now. Now I'm looking at how culture is embedded. But my first PhD was medieval. I hate saying this. My first PhD was medieval history. So I'm a medievalist and an ethno-historian. And I put history into many of my novels, as if I wrote many. I put history into all my novels in one way or another, even if they're contemporary. Because I'm a historian, I can't not do it.
Excellent. Lawrence.
My name is Lawrence Raphael Brothers. Pronouns are he and him. I'm a writer and a technologist, not a historian per se, but I have written and published a number of historical fantasy stories. Most recently, a novel of mine, Twilight Patrol, came out last year. That's a World War I era portal fantasy, but it does have
the investigation for my thesis, that really did kind of help expand a lot of things. Like this notion of like this immutability of the past is totally untrue. This notion that, we understand the past and it's this one thing, and then that can be right or wrong. I mean, there's just all of that just kind of went out the window. And I think it's interesting because over the course of doing this thesis on Mesoamerican culture, I was also writing this 1940s New York novel. And of course, like on the surface, they really have basically nothing to do with one another. I mentioned Mexico once in the novel, kind of like an Easter egg for myself, but I would say that the kind of attitude I learned to adopt from in my historical research, especially because I was balancing those two things, really informed how I dealt with a novel. Because a novel, though it's set in 1940s, what I was most interested in at the end was the relationship between both the characters and their past. So the characters are in the 40s, and this kind of like linchpin event, because they're mostly Black characters, is the Civil War. And then our modern day, which of course the characters are not aware of, but they're kind of aware of the future in a sort of general sense. And then the perspective of the reader, who is the same distance from the past of the characters as the characters are from the past of the Civil War. And so like that kind of middle zone was part of like my kind of, I don't know, it's like thematic or like philosophical exploration of these ideas of what is history and how does it affect us. And exactly, I mean, it's all cultural. And so trying to, it's not trying to get away from that anymore. It's trying to really like understand that, where am I? And then how does that relate?
And
so I would totally agree with like everything you just said. I remember when I was studying history at Grinnell College, my African-American history prof was like, this is the only subject where when you get to the college level, they tell you to forget everything that you learned before, because at the lower levels, history is taught as though it is a timeline of known facts. And yet we know that like even if you ask 5 people about something that happened 5 minutes ago, you're going to get 5 different stories. And so, everybody has a particular lens, a particular motive for telling a story. And, that's really interesting to play with in fiction. And then it really affects what you look to find out about when you're researching your fiction. And possibly like what you knew about in the first place. So like, for instance, when Nisi Shaw wrote Everfair, I don't know if you guys have written this or read this. This is a steampunk, but history. There was a very violent, terrible person who was supported by the European powers in being, king or whatever it was, emperor of a section of Africa for a while. And that was something that she wanted to include, partly because a lot of people in the world just don't even know that story. And I thought that was a really interesting choice. I hadn't really known that story. And so it affects the context where the characters are. But it also, I think, deepens people's understanding. Like there's a tendency to be like, oh, well, this is set in Africa, or this is set in indigenous North America. And as someone of Native American ancestry myself, and it's just always so frustrating when people were like, oh, so this was by a Northern American tribe. And I was like, well, this was the Susquehannock. They didn't live the same way as, the Wyandot, and I recently read, for instance, 1491. Have you read that, Elia?
I've read parts of it. I haven't read the whole thing.
Which is about what the Americas looked like, like before Columbus got here. And it's just, there are some, it's fascinating to me how the narrative about what that looked like changed over time because people had political agendas about it. So according to it, if you actually look at the historical documents of the time, and like, for instance, in South America, there were monks and very literate people writing down their observations and giving us an impression, a very solid impression, for instance, as to how many people were killed by viruses.
Yeah.
And then later on, the narrative was like, oh, well, it wasn't that many. There couldn't possibly have been such an expansive, technologically advanced culture there. You know, they were, when we met them, they were not that advanced. And so it changed, and now people are like, why don't we believe the people who were there?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Gillian.
The things that Elia and Anne have been saying are, when they're not in just one writer, they cut right across cultures. And so when you categorize them, it's easier to see them when you read a new book. So the three things that you've talked about so far are silencing. When you silence a group of people by making them invisible in the culture that's their own, which happens quite frequently. There's making things a hierarchy. So the dominant people are the often white, often colonial, but not always. And they are the ones who interpret the experience of everyone else. That's when you get the static past, because everybody who's not dominant in the hierarchy is meant to move with the hierarchy, to be part of that. And so they're always inferior. And this is the whole, what people are calling the colonialist view in the past, but it's actually a setting of class and saying you are our domestic equivalent culturally, so you can only appear in novels as stereotypes. And that's the third thing, is that when we write, we're writing from idioculture, from our own. It's like the idiolect. It's your personal culture. And when you share it with other people, it's diaculture, it's shared culture. But the mainstream writers, the white Americans, if you like, because that's the most common group that does this, worldwide is the most common group in the English-speaking world, basically says all the complexities that you've permitted comes from this one cultural base, and that is mine, the writers. And so other cultures are simplified. They're reduced in complexity and capacity to change and dynamism. And so I just analysed what you both said, and I'm very sorry about that. That's a habit of mine.
Cultures are simplified or simply ignored. When my daughter is 10, and one of her classes, they were talking about Greek history, and they're talking about waterways and stuff like that. And I was like, did the teacher tell you what was on the other side of the water?
But that's silencing.
Yeah.
That comes under that.
But a lot of that just comes from the fact that we're ignorant.
Yes.
But we're ignorant because we're carrying baggage. We're ignorant because we don't know how to ask, or we don't want to ask.
And we've also filled the space that we assume is empty. It's interesting to listen to and read reviews by ordinary people, particularly young people, something I started doing during the 30 years I was a teacher. And that is, when they read historical fiction, there were roughly, for purposes of discussion, two groups. The ones that said, oh, I understand it all now because the people are just like me. And then there was the group that said, I don't like the story because everybody talks like an American. Why aren't they talking like people of the time? So that person is trying to question across the water and find out what really was there. The other one is just assuming their space fills it out, that all North America was completely empty when the Pilgrims came. So yes, it's time for us to go and develop industry. And that's the way I was taught in the 50s.
Our God-given divine mandate.
Yeah.
There's
Yes.
these weird there's these weird concretized assumptions that get passed on through school and through popular culture that, they're not necessarily conscious decisions to be biased or to have distorted lenses on the past. They're just unconscious carryovers that are lazy and characteristically assumed by people who haven't really delved into any particular subject with an open mind. And since most of us have to have assumptions that we carry with us in order to manage our understanding of the world at all, it's not really surprising that these distortions get carried forward. But it is kind of a duty to examine them and break them down when they're clearly wrong or clearly biased or clearly bigoted in some way.
Yes. Yes. We don't have any
It's
questions.
not right.
So
It's not wrong to write them into a novel. It's wrong to write them into a novel unquestioningly.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, sometimes it's important, in fact, really important to show people's biases or these sorts of unquestioned assumptions and then question them. I think that can be, useful and powerful. I mean, sometimes it's good to do it explicitly. Sometimes you can kind of do it just through showing, that things aren't the way that people expect. The problem is sometimes you get a lot of pushback, both from editors and from readers
Yes.
who claim that, oh, well, this is a historical, or this isn't, or like the best is if you're writing speculative fiction, they'll assume things are speculative that aren't. They'll assume that, oh, wasn't it great that you wrote all of these, this diversity into the past because it's magical or something. It's like, no, that's not what I did, like that. I just writing a historical novel, that has magical elements, but it's not, the magical elements isn't like the presence of non-white people with agency. Like that isn't the magical part,
Yeah.
And I think that it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, it's interesting because as writers, of course, we have to try to like go beyond and break our own cultural assumptions, or at the very least examine them. I mean, I guess this is an impossible task. It's not like we're going to actually achieve this, but we have to do the work in any case. But as readers also, it's incredibly important to try to kind of take a step back and wonder if the reason why something is not meeting our historical expectations is not because it's wrong, but because it's going against what we were taught, or what, not even explicitly, right? Like just like what our cultural assumptions are, like that can't possibly be useful to follow an Indigenous character or to follow a Black character. This just, and they're very, very deep seated. It's you really have to kind of root that out, or at the very least examine it. And I think sometimes as writers, we're facing an uphill battle in that. I think hopefully things are changing a little. Certainly in a lot of the younger generations, I think there's a kind of more conscious awareness of how these biases can affect us. But even so, I think kind of everybody has to try to examine or question like that initial kind of pushback reaction, because otherwise you end up with a lot of historical fiction that's kind of only in conversation with like a really narrow band of historical fiction, not
That's
even
right.
primary sources.
That's right.
Yeah, you see that a lot, like when there's a movie that has, Robin of Locksley having a Moor as his assistant, and people are like, that would never have happened. And it's like, well, the Moors traveled all over the place. What are you talking about?
Right. It's like in the original story. Like, what?
I mean, even the Morte d'Arthur has all these Saracens and Moorish knights all over the place.
There's one thing that's really important that came out when I was doing my research. I directly interviewed 25 to 30 people, talked to a lot of other writers, and sure, that included you. You were part of the general talk and had no idea. I listened to what people were saying because I wanted to find out what writers were carrying with them, not just what writers were writing, but what they were carrying into the writing. And what I found out was really interesting. It's genre dependent, it's subgenre dependent. So you don't have to question everything. You need to question the things you're carrying into that novel because of its genre.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there are so many times when we have assumptions even about the whiteness, because it's like the default expectation of authors. Since the Black Lives Matter movement, got a lot of white people looking into references and conversations they might not have seen before. I've seen people express great surprise at finding out that Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers, was Black.
Yes.
For instance.
Yes.
Yeah, that one is astonishing to me. But I mean, that's great. I guess, that we've decided to stop erasing that,
Yeah.
But France is not that far from Africa, so it never surprised me. What surprises me is how many people forget that France's colonialism was in North Africa.
Yes.
A lot of France is not racially.
That
white.
was just the white people going over there. Nobody traveled the other way, right?
No, never.
Right. Or, I mean, it's interesting, especially in historical fiction of the 18th and 19th century, how white it can be, considering that they are almost always taking place in the primary countries that like were colonizing the rest of the world, you know, especially non-white parts of the world. That kind of obviously this would mean that like this very nature of colonization is that those cultures, even in a very brutal way, are still kind of coming together, that those people are moving, that there's the kind of fluidity between them that just doesn't get shown. It just sort of gets kind of like pushed out. And it's interesting because sometimes if you read literature, you know, from the time, or nonfiction from the time, like the idea of what they're living through and the diversity of their own place is so different. You know, it's
what
so
I was
different.
thinking, that there's a difference between 21st century view of the 19th century and the 19th century itself.
Exactly.
And the 19th century is a very ugly place if you take Western Europe. Really ugly, but not white ugly, complex ugly, diverse ugly.
But at the same time, like, people were already Homo sapiens, right? Like, I think there's a tendency to be like, oh, that was 700 years ago, so they weren't as smart as us. Otherwise, they would have been living like us, right? You know.
Yeah.
In our post-racial society.
This is one of the cultural baggages we carry and put in our fiction without knowing it. I'm Jewish. I'm allowed to be intelligent. I'm not allowed to be I'm not allowed to be poor. But I'm allowed to be intelligent. That we carry the stereotypes, and the stereotypes include the things I said before. In Australia as Jewish, I have to be silenced. If I'm not silent, I'm not as acceptable. In a hierarchy, I'm off the hierarchy. If you're Black American in Australia, you're higher up the hierarchy than Indigenous Australians.
Part of the problem.
So it's really complex, but it's not. It's really complex, but it applies in ways we don't tend to think about. This is why we have to break it all down and rethink. I've been watching K-drama to break it down for myself, because if I can work out why they're the center of their universe, I can work out who thinks they're the center of our universe and why.
Exactly. Part of the problem is that we're reading, particularly what we were shaped by literature of the 18th and 19th century. It was written in English, and we're reading English. If we read German literature or Turkish literature or Persian literature, we're going to get a completely different view of that time. But we're not seeing that. Particularly Americans tend to be mono-language. So when you start learning another language, you get a very different view of the world. You start hearing these voices that otherwise were invisible to you.
But these ossified tendencies, I think, I think fiction in particular has a very strong influence on causing and propagating this kind of ossification through the generations, because the classics of literature are read by the next generation and form their opinions. So Kipling or somebody like that, his views could get, transmitted through generation after generation of subsequent writer who used, those works either consciously or unconsciously as the basis for their own understanding of history and world culture.
That's right.
So, it's the, there's a lot of the reader outrage about what they think are historical elements in historical fiction come from these assumptions, not based on their study of history or of other cultures, but on their reading of historical novels. So there's a very strong responsibility on the part of a writer of historical fiction to break these ossified views and to come up with new lenses to look at the past.
Yeah,
it's true.
That's true, and it's all throughout our culture. I would say, as a substitute teacher, I've been in all kinds of different contexts, and there's some people are trying to improve the picture, now, but like to give a simple example, a lot of us learned the Pythagorean theorem when we were in school. Okay. Named after Pythagoras. Did he invent it? No, it came from Persia. Somebody in the Persian Empire figured out that math, and somebody traveled back and forth. But Pythagoras published some of it, and then 70 years later or something, people, after he died, people started calling it by his name. So we often have things like that make it easy to assume, oh, this piece of culture came from here because we know it by that person, when that's not true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's current appropriation of culture, and there's also us kind of bringing along a past appropriation of culture, which then just kind of becomes part of the accepted wisdom, which is, as you say, Lawrence, one of the reasons why we have a lot of responsibility to try to undo those things, or at the very least address them more responsibly.
It's also, sometimes it's a completely innocent, propagation of something which you honestly believe to be true, but then turns out later not to be, So, I mean, everybody knew for a long time that the Native American cultures didn't come up with the wheel. But, they did come up with the wheel. They just made the choice not to exploit it as a chemical technology.
Yeah, and if you spend any significant amount of time in central Mexico, you understand why. Because they are filled is nothing but rocky hills. I mean, it's like really fertile rocky hills. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, honestly, like you just have to go up and down, and it's extremely hard. And you don't have dynamite to blast it away. It just makes a lot more sense to walk. Like,
and it really does. They had much cleverer beasts of burden as well.
I mean, in this part of Mexico, they did not actually have beasts of burden.
I guess I'm thinking of the Andes.
Yeah, in the Andes they did, but they didn't come to. Well, actually, I don't think llamas can live in this region anyway. But a lot of foodstuffs, for example, like there was a Columbian exchange between obviously the Europe and the Americas in general, but also within the Americas, things like potatoes didn't arrive in Mexico from the Andes really until the Spanish conquest.
Yeah.
When we're writing, we start with, I'm writing this novel about. So we don't think about you don't think, so if you're world building, so if you're writing from a world build that you've done, you think about the rockiness of the mountains, the appropriateness of the wheel. But if you're saying this is a historical novel or historical fantasy or time travel, then you're saying this is set in this place at this time, and you instantly take on the baggage of your previous understanding of that place and time. And when we write, we're in story space. It's a writer story space as opposed to the reader one. And that contains everything we have at our fingertips when we want to write about the novel. The things you've researched, you've questioned, that you've fitted them into the structure of the novel. The things you haven't researched, you draw from your previous experience. So this is why the wheel we all know about the wheel works everywhere, because and so unless someone actually knows that background is just really stupid to have a wheel, the assumption is that the people were not very bright and didn't use a wheel.
Yes, exactly.
And people will carry the baggage of the terrain they know unless they question that. Does that make sense?
And with regard to what Lawrence was saying about this being, perfectly innocent to continue to pass these presumptions along, I think that's part of what really a lot of activists, social justice activists, are saying right now in the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff is, no, we've mentioned to you many times that this is the dominant way of behaving. You are not being innocent if you don't question it. You are being complicit.
Right.
But it's easy to be complicit unintentionally when we write, because we're taught to test the complicitness with politics. And now these days that is you have to question people who claim innocence but still actually read the newspaper. But when you say, I'm going to write a novel where, I don't know, a white male teenager goes back to 1500 and saves the world, how the instant you have your standard protagonist, you carry the baggage that goes with that standard protagonist. And it's easier to get a novel published if you have a standard protagonist going back to a known historical period.
Yes, it's true. It's
And
true.
there's a I think an interesting kind of parallel point to that, which is that a lot of, I think, what makes that baggage, even if you're sort of aware of it, kind of seem more appealing or innocuous, is this notion that a lot of people have of historical fiction being a kind of comfort read or something that you just
Yes.
don't want to be challenged in. And I mean, when it comes down to it, there's no ahistorical moment in history. You know, there's no place you can go back to where you don't have to deal with all of this messy stuff that we are dealing with right now, especially not anywhere post, you know, the conquest of the Americas. You know, I mean,
You want us to show the downtrodden peasants in the medieval era how it goes?
Right, but you can't, and especially a lot of the historical time periods that are used really specifically for these sort of comfort reads. I'm talking about like the Regency and Regency romance novels, for example.
Yes.
You know, that I think a lot of those writers kind of really explicitly don't want to question and don't want to kind of break open some of these bubbles that have formed around like notions of what's appropriate that can really, a lot of them, be traced right back to Georgette Heyer,
Yes.
who was writing in like the first half and like the middle part of the 20th century, and herself sorry.
She created an alternate universe and deliberately excluded common people and Jews except as moneylenders and so forth.
Oh God, her anti-Semitism is appalling.
And
Well, I mean, this is derived from Austen and the Brontes and people like that too, you know.
Right, but she was writing basically fanfic for Austen.
Yes.
And a really specific fanfic for Austen that excluded, I mean, Austen herself is not, you know, without any of this baggage, but she's very much, she's writing about her time in a way that I think explores it in a much better way than what Heyer ended up doing. And I say this as a fan of Heyer's work, but as a, you know, as a service to our understanding of history, Heyer really didn't do that much. And I think the kind of legacy of that is really complex. And I think it makes it really hard now for writers trying to write in the Regency period who do not want to go back to that well and actually try to question some of these assumptions or really explore that real, totally lived diversity of that time period in Regency England and all of that our idea of history, and very specifically of this history as being kind of like comforting or romantic, kind of it really makes it hard for non-white writers to break in. It makes it really hard for white writers who want to write more diversely or kind of deal with other perspectives. You know, it really,
yes.
Yeah.
So the Regency isn't the only one. The Regency is the best studied. There are squillions of studies on it. But Nancy Mitford created an alternate world for her own England, and
that's right.
And Anne Radcliffe created an alternate world for Gothic horror.
Yeah.
So and you've got a lot of this is why the genre fix is really important. When you're working in genre, you're often working in a descendant of someone else's world creation when you put history into it.
Yes. Very much so.
Identifying where that comes from is the first battle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think Austen would have been appalled by Georgette Heyer, actually, because
she definitely would have been.
If you read Austen, there is not one noble-born person that we are set up to admire. Not one. They're all assholes. But Heyer, blood will always tell. Huge distinction there. However, American writers do their research in Heyer and reproduce her errors. So it's interesting studying that. But parallel to that, I think it's interesting that real events that are shared become story and are learned as history through story later. Like I was born in 1951. So I was 12 years old when John F. Kennedy was killed, which electrified the world. All the adults were crying. Many of them were afraid that the Russians were going to attack. We had bomb drills, okay, come up a bunch of decades, and there are young people who first don't know what the initials JFK mean, and second of all, they hear about it through rock songs or through a web comic, and that's what they know about what happened then. They're learning their history through fiction.
Or through the Umbrella Academy.
Yes,
Everyone
through
knows
the
Kennedy who is right now because of the Umbrella Academy.
Right.
But yeah, that's what I'm saying, that it's not, Georgette has the well-studied, well-known one, because Regency is such a popular genre.
Yep.
But a lot of our fiction goes back, way back to this person was really influential, and so we copy. So Richard III, his whole reputation in two different extreme versions come from two different interpretations straight after his death.
Well, and I think one of the fascinating things about American history, as I've studied it, is that, you know, we can observe how segregated we are, but we don't realize how much that is also reflected in our stories about American history. So, or about North American history. So earlier in the conversation, I was reminded when I went to college, I became good friends with a fellow who'd grown up in Mexico. And if you've grown up in the United States, for instance, and you think of the Mexican-American War, you might think, remember the Alamo, because movies were made about that and stuff. Well, the Mexicans remember the Alamo. What they remember is that there was a school building where students climbed to the top of the school building, wrapped themselves in the Mexican flag, and jumped off of the roof in protest. Because the Americans were stealing Mexican territory. So that's their narrative of the Alamo. And we are completely ignorant of it. And similarly, like as far as like in the area I live right now, which is central Pennsylvania, I have a bunch of people that I interact with who, for instance, are very aware that in the 1980s, there was a part, like basically a whole block in Philadelphia that ended up getting burned down because the government bombed a Black Power community. And like in the middle of a very closely built together neighborhood, right? And like, we don't, generally speaking, white people in this area don't know that narrative. Black people in Philadelphia in this area are much more likely to know, you know, holy, you know, whatever, if you really insist on your own rights and your own ability to do what you want to in your own house and be armed the way that white people own their right to be armed and defend yourself, the powers that be will just destroy you. And will not face any consequences from it. That is the narrative that a lot of Black families know very deeply. They've heard many different versions of it. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, more and more white Americans are hearing it, but we have not grown up with it. It has not been a warning to say, you know, this is something that can endanger your life, so know it. You know what I mean? So it's just, it makes us all have these completely different experiences of life in the same society, which I think also makes it doubly important that we do push publishers to do better at publishing things by diverse authors, because those stories, even if white authors try to tell them, we don't really understand.
I think we need to change the genre choices we make as well. So we're not forced into a standardized narrative, so that readers have a wider choice of actual stories, of types of stories. So there's a complex dynamic between teller and audience in how we tell the past. We still need our comfort reads. We still need our Regency.
But you can push that. You could have a comfort read. Like one of the things.
I'm not saying that we I'm saying we don't get rid of what we have. We add to it. We have a more
Yes, we add to it.
situation. We ask
2
what
minutes.
history are we putting into genre, and in some cases we let it stay. In other cases we do something entirely different. But we have a publisher decision to accept diverse narratives, not just narratives by diverse people.
Right. But like, for instance, there's a science fiction author named Melissa Cole, and Alyssa also writes historical romance fiction. So for instance, this is a book by her. It's called An Extraordinary Union. It's part of a series. And it's based, like, initially she was studying her own genealogy. So like, it wasn't a publisher who was like, hey, I want diverse stories. She was like, what happened back then and who was doing it? And she discovered, for instance, that there were free Black people who went during the Civil War, who went south to spy on white families who tended to treat Black people as, you know, part of the furniture. And so the main character in this novel is one of those spies, but, and so it's completely accurate to history, but it is also a very sexy historical romance. The one thing though is
fun to read.
It's very fun to read. I will say, like, she gets involved with a white man who's also a union agent, and there are issues. Like, at one point, he's thinking to himself, like, I love how this is a critical thought that white readers need to understand, but it also feels kind of modern. It says, he'd always prided himself as a friend and ally to every man who sought equality, but was that true? Or had he imagined himself a savior instead?
It's true. We have like 30 seconds left, and I want to get to these comments real quick before I have to close up. An audience member observed that a lot of Greek and Roman culture was filtered through Muslim culture because it was copied into Arabic, which is interesting. And Lawrence had a great comment that for Regency romance, from a diverse point of view, there are authors like Zen Cho, who writes lovely books that could be comfort reads, but it's not all just white people. So it's entirely possible to do that. And Anne, so thank you very much for attending this first panel.
Thank you, everybody.